A quiet house sat on 110th Street in Cottage Grove, Minnesota. The air was still except for the soft shuffle of dogs on cool tile and the warm scent of pumpkin drifting from a slow cooker on the counter. Afternoon light slid through lace curtains, cutting thin, golden lines across the floor. Everything about the Allwine home spoke of comfort, routine, order, peace. Then the doorbell rang. Stephen Allwine paused his work in the basement office. Upstairs, Amy wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and moved toward the sound. On the porch stood two figures, an FBI special agent and a local detective. Faces serious, voices measured. They carried news no one could prepare for. Someone somewhere had paid to have Amy Allwine killed. They knew her travel schedule. They knew the model of her car. They even had a photograph of her face. And they wanted it to look like an accident. If you're new here, welcome. We talk about true crime cases here on this channel, so if that's something that you're interested in, then please come and join us. Make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any future videos. The house that moments earlier felt safe, now felt impossibly small. The agent opened a folder, its contents precise and cold. Screenshots from a hidden corner of the internet, messages traded for Bitcoin, coordinates of planned accidents, the words blurred before Amy's eyes. Target will be traveling to Moline, Illinois. Strike near the airport. Ensure fatality. Her first thought was confusion. Who could possibly hate her? Her second was fear. Whoever it was knew everything. Her church schedule, her work trips, even the way she drove. As the agents explained the dark web network called Bassa Mafia, the term sounded unreal, like something from fiction, not faith-filled Minnesota suburbia. Yet every line in that folder led back to her life, her movements, her name. The ordinary hum of that November day had been shattered, and from that single knock on the door, the nightmare began. The house on 110th Street had not always known fear. Long before the knock at the door, Amy Zotz grew up beneath the gray skies of Minnesota, one of 3 children in a family where faith ruled the rhythm of every day. Her parents, Charles and Joanne, believed in discipline and devotion. They were part of the Worldwide Church of God, a congregation that followed scripture to the letter. Sundays were for quiet reflection, not play. Friends came from church gatherings, not from school corridors. Amy learned early that goodness wasn't loud. She was the kind of girl who smiled easily, obeyed quickly, and believed deeply. When she reached high school in Woodbury, her world remained small but content. No parties, no dances, only church socials where laughter stayed clean and the music never swayed too close to sin. Within those rules, she found joy. She cheered for the church basketball team, choreographing routines that made even stern elders smile. Her happiness came from structure, her confidence from belief. In the early 1990s, Amy left home to attend Ambassador College in Big Sandy, Texas, a campus built by her church, a place meant to recapture true values. The air there was hot and fragrant with pine. It was the first time she'd ever lived outside Minnesota. She met a quiet young man named Stephen Allwine, a computer-savvy student from Spokane, Washington. They met in the IT department, where both worked part-time, and their connection grew slowly, built on shared values and hours spent dancing at church socials. Amy, graceful and bright, found comfort in Stephen's steadiness. When the church splintered years later, fractured into new denominations, Amy and Stephen chose the United Church of God, a group that clung to the old commandments, but embraced technology as a tool for spreading the gospel. For Stephen, who loved computers, it was the perfect balance between faith and progress. When they graduated, he followed her back to St. Paul so she could remain near her family. They married on a warm August day in 1996. Her father placed her hand in Stephen's and told him to take care of his little girl. Together they built a life that reflected their values: disciplined, faithful, organized. They attended church every Saturday, arriving early and staying until evening, never missing a service. They refused to celebrate Christmas or Easter, calling them pagan. But every autumn, they traveled for the church's fall festival, held in new cities each year. They were ordained as deacon and deaconess, later rising to elder and teacher. To friends, they were the couple others turned to for advice, the pair who smiled through every sermon and lived exactly as they preached. In 2007, after years of trying for children, Amy and Stephen adopted a baby boy just 2 days old. They named him Joe. The adoption was open. They stayed in touch with the birth other, grateful and reverent for the gift she'd given them. From the moment Amy held him, her world narrowed to his tiny heartbeat. When she talked about her son, a friend recalled, Her face went from happy to happier, if that's possible. Their home filled with laughter and the clutter of everyday life. Unfinished Lego castles, dog hair clinging to couches, the smell of baking, and wet paws. Each Friday, the Allwines drove to Amy's parents' house for dinner. Her father cooked. Her mother brought out the good china. Amy arrived with dessert, usually strawberry pie, because it was her mother's favorite. As Joe grew, she taught him to choose the berries himself, showing him how to spot the perfect red. Amy's warmth extended to her animals. She loved them with the same patience she showed people. After years teaching at a local obedience school, she opened her own business, Active Dog Sports Training, and turned a large shed on their property into a training arena nearly bigger than the house itself. She specialized in agility trials and scent detection, guiding dogs and owners through each obstacle with gentle humor. Her clients adored her. Her friends described her as the salt of the earth, always smiling, never gossiping, never unkind. By 2016, Amy and Steven's world looked picture perfect. Faith, family, and the small Minnesota acreage where life moved quietly. From the outside, nothing seemed to miss. No cracks in the marriage, no shadows on their doorstep. But somewhere behind the digital curtain of the internet, someone was watching them closely. Someone who knew their routines, their addresses, even their child's name. And within months, that unseen observer would set into motion the events that shattered everything they believed in. The manila folder on Amy's kitchen counter held the kind of words you don't forget. Across its pages ran digital threads, traced from the depths of the dark web. Messages, transaction logs, and photographs that pulled her quiet Minnesota life into something unthinkable. The FBI agent spoke evenly, careful with tone, as if calm might soften what was being said. The website, he explained, called itself Basa Mafia. It was presented as a place where anyone could hire a killer as easily as hiring a plumber. An online market promising professional hitman for a price paid in Bitcoin. The name, they said, came from an Albanian word, meaning trust. Behind it was a man known only as Ura, a Romanian running the site from overseas. The promise was anonymity. The reality was a marketplace that fed on desperation, greed, and hate. In February 2016, months before the agents arrived, an anonymous user had contacted that site. The username was Dog Day God. Their first message was short, a request for help with a job. They asked how to convert cash to Bitcoin without attracting attention, how to make a large withdrawal look harmless. The operator responded within hours, suggesting gambling or buying electronics as excuses, even providing names of traders who exchanged currency without identification. Over the next few days, the conversation deepened. The user explained they wanted a hit to look like an accident, a car crash, preferably. The target's name was Amy Allwine. They included her photograph pulled from a family trip to Hawaii, her address in Cottage Grove, and her travel plans to a dog training competition in Molina, Illinois. They knew her schedule down to the day and time. March 19th at the Linta Inn, March 20th at the Quad City Christian School. Basa Mafia replied with prices, a standard job. $5,000 in Bitcoin for a simple shooting, an extra $4,000 if it needed to look like an accident. After a few exchanges, they agreed on $6,000 for what was described as a low-level gang member who would ram her vehicle at an intersection and flee in a stolen car. The agent showed Amy the words as they appeared online. Each line carried the flat indifference of a business deal. No emotion, no urgency, just instructions for ending a life. Make sure it looks accidental. Strike the driver's side. Use a stolen car. Amy's throat tightened. The room seemed smaller. The hum of the refrigerator became loud. The FBI believed Basa Mafia itself was a scam, that the people behind it collected money but never sent anyone out to kill. Yet, they couldn't ignore the fact that someone had been willing to pay, to plan, and to send money through the blockchain. Scam or not, the intention was real. They told her the messages spanned months. When the so-called hitman failed to act in Illinois, Dog Day God tried again, suggesting new methods, different times, even a fire. She will be home between 9 and noon. One message read, hit her house, burn it after. The digital trail painted a picture of obsession. The sender described Amy as a rival business owner, accused her of sleeping with her husband, complained that she was stealing clients. They called her this, and said she had torn my family apart. Each note carried more detail, her vehicles, her family, her daily routine, until it read less like rumor and more like surveillance. By the time the website's database was hacked and its contents leaked that April, The correspondence between Dog Day God and Bassa Mafia stretched to nearly 150 messages. Every one of them revolved around Amy. The FBI explained that her name appeared in the leaked orders as Target 30312, one among dozens around the world, proof that someone had gone beyond anger into action. The money trail existed. The photo was real. And though Bassa Mafia would later be exposed as an elaborate fraud, the threat against Amy Allwine was not imagined. That afternoon, the agents closed their folders and left the Allwine home, surrounded by silence. The door clicked shut, and the ordinary hum returned. The faint ticking of the kitchen clock, the dog shifting by the window, the slow cooker still breathing spice into the air. Amy stood by the table, staring at the place where the folder had been. For the first time in her life, faith offered no comfort. Somewhere, someone she knew wanted her dead. Days turned into weeks, and though Amy tried to carry on with her quiet life, the weight of the FBI's visit clung to her like a shadow. She returned to her routines, dog training, church, family dinners. But the rhythm had changed. Every sound outside made her look twice. Every unfamiliar car at the end of their long driveway felt like a warning. She began sleeping with her phone by her pillow, checking the locks twice before bed. Stephen reassured her that it was over, that whoever had made the threat was probably long gone. But deep down, Amy felt something darker still hovered around them, something unfinished. Then, one late July afternoon, she opened her email. At the top of her inbox sat a new message from an address she didn't recognize. The name was simple, Jane. There was no subject line. When she clicked, the first line froze her in place. Amy, your family is in danger. The message went on to accuse her of selfishness, of ignoring an earlier solution. It spoke of vengeance, of punishment, of how she had supposedly ruined someone's life. The writer claimed to know about her son, her husband, even her extended family, listing her parents' home in Woodbury, her brother in St. Paul, her sister out east. Then the email turned darker. It described how to sabotage a car by injecting water into the brake lines, how to trigger a gas explosion by puncturing the meter outside her house. It mentioned that Amy's home and business both had meters on the east side, while her parents' meter sat on the south. The words were written without emotion, just instructions like notes in a manual. And then came the line that made Amy's knees weaken. I saw your son wearing a bright pink shirt last Friday. Her hand trembled on the mouse. That detail was true. Joe had worn that exact shirt while helping her pick strawberries in the yard. But other things were wrong. Her sister had moved months ago. The email listed her old address. Whoever this was, they were close. But not quite close enough. That inconsistency didn't comfort her. It terrified her more. It meant someone had once been watching. Amy felt her pulse rising, her throat tightening. She checked her spam folder on instinct and found another message sent days earlier from the same Jane. The first line was worse. I still blame you for my life falling apart. It went on for pages, each sentence a knife. The writer called her vile names, accused her of seducing a married man, and swore that since direct revenge was too risky, they would instead destroy everything she loved. They described exactly how they'd learned to make accidents happen, how to cut brake lines, how to blow up a gas meter, how to stalk a family without being seen. Then came the demand. Here's how you can save them. Commit suicide. If you don't, one by one, they'll pay for your selfishness. They listed the methods she should use, even warning her about what might fail. Pick a reliable method. The message said, you only get one chance. If you survive, they'll take you for crazy, lock you up, and your family will still die. It ended with a deadline, 2 weeks. By the time Stephen came upstairs, Amy was pale and shaking. She showed him the emails without a word. He read in silence, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. We'll contact Agent Silky, he said. He'll know what to do. That night, Amy couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made her heart jump. The glow from the porch light stretched long across the wall, and in that dim reflection, she saw her life unraveling. She thought of her parents, her son, her friends at church, all of them suddenly under threat because of something she didn't understand. By morning, she called the FBI. Special Agent Asher Silky arrived within hours, his voice steady but grave. He took her computer, her phone, and the family laptop. Each was mirrored, copied, returned days later with no new answers. The messages, he said, were untraceable, sent through disposable accounts that vanished after delivery. To the FBI. It appeared the writer wasn't trying to physically harm her anymore. The pattern had changed from hiring a killer to forcing Amy to destroy herself. It's a shift in control, Silky explained quietly. Whoever this is wants power. They want you afraid. But to Amy, the change didn't make her feel safer. It made her feel hunted in a different way, by words instead of weapons. At night, she sat awake, listening for footsteps outside, the dogs restless at her feet. She could almost feel eyes on her through the windows. The email's final line echoed in her mind, until it blurred into her dreams. Your family doesn't need you. Save them. Do it soon. And in the stillness of that house on 110th Street, a woman once full of warmth now lived in quiet dread, waiting for an enemy she couldn't see, and a reason she couldn't name. By the time August faded into early fall, the Allwine home no longer felt like the same place it once was. The warmth that used to define it, the smell of Amy's baking, the laughter echoing through the hallways, had thinned into something tight and watchful. Every night before turning off the lights, Amy walked the perimeter of the house, locking each window and checking every door herself. Stephen had started making changes. The first thing he did was update the security system. The old keypad by the front entry was replaced with a digital panel that required a new code, one that only he and Amy knew. Motion sensors were added along the back hall, near the kitchen, and inside the garage. He ordered 4 new cameras, small, black, almost invisible, mounted above the front door, along the driveway, and by the training barn where Amy ran her dog classes. A 5th camera covered the living room, its lens reflecting faintly in the glow of the television. When the installer left, Stephen tested every angle himself, checking each feed from his laptop until the images were crystal clear. Amy watched quietly from the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. After the second Jane email arrived, she'd stopped letting Joe play outside alone. Even walking from the house to the dog arena now made her uneasy. At night, she left the porch lights on, and when the dogs barked, she froze until Stephen told her it was probably nothing. They bought a handgun, a Smith & Wesson M&P shield, and kept it in a biometric safe next to the bed. Stephen handled it like a professional, showing Amy how to unlock it, how to check the magazine, how to release the slide. She tried to learn, though her hands shook the first time she held it. Just in case, he told her. Stephen went further, applying for a concealed carry permit. He completed the training quietly without telling anyone at church. The gun began traveling with him, holstered under his jacket, beside him in the car, resting on the nightstand when he slept. Amy, meanwhile, looked for a way to feel less helpless. That fall, she signed up for the Citizens Police Academy in Cottage Grove, a community program that taught basic self-defense, emergency response, and police procedure. Every Thursday evening, she drove to the station for classes. Neighbors saw her leave in her grey SUV, a notebook tucked under her arm. There, among retirees and college students, she learned how 911 dispatch worked, how patrol units responded to calls, how fingerprinting and evidence collection really happened. But what fascinated her most were the K9 demonstrations. She loved watching the dogs work. German Shepherds and Belgian Malinois trained to find what humans couldn't. The trainers noticed her interest and invited her to a ride along. One cold October evening, she took them up on it. She sat in the passenger seat of a squad car beside Officer Mike Murphy and his K9 partner Rex. The night air was crisp, the radio murmuring softly as they patrolled quiet streets. When Rex alerted on a scent, the dog's focus transfixed her. They always know, the officer said, smiling. You can't fool their nose. Amy smiled back faintly, watching the dog disappear into the dark. For a brief moment, she felt something close to safety, like being next to a force that could actually sense danger before it came. She never told anyone outside law enforcement what she was living through. Not her church friends, not her dog training students, not even her parents, who still thought the FBI's visit months earlier had been a misunderstanding. Amy didn't want to worry them. To them, she was still the bright daughter who made strawberry pies on Fridays and taught obedience classes on weekends. But inside the house on 110th Street, life had narrowed to vigilance. A routine that once ran on faith, now ran on fear. Each night, Amy double-checked the door code, glanced at the camera feed, and placed her phone within reach. She still prayed before bed, but her prayers had changed. They were no longer about blessings or gratitude. They were about survival. November 13th, 2016. A quiet Sunday in Cottage Grove. The kind of day that would have passed unnoticed, if not for what was about to happen. That morning, the Allwines attended church like they always did. The sermon was about faithfulness, about the strength of keeping promises even when they become heavy to carry. Amy sat beside Stephen in the pew, her hands folded neatly, her eyes distant. Friends later said she looked pale, but composed, smiling politely during the closing hymn. After the service, they lingered for small talk, then drove home in silence. The air outside was unseasonably warm for November. The wind carried the last scent of autumn leaves, and the sky hung grey and low over the trees. Amy changed into a t-shirt and jeans, slipped off her shoes, and went to the kitchen. She set a small pumpkin on the counter and began slicing it for puree, something she'd planned to bake into bread later that week. The scent of cinnamon filled the room. Again, familiar and comforting. Around noon, Stephen worked downstairs in his office while Joe played with the dogs in the living room. Everything seemed ordinary until Amy called down that she wasn't feeling well. She said her mouth was dry, her head light. She thought maybe it was vertigo. She'd had dizzy spells before, but this felt stronger. "I just need to lie down," she murmured, heading toward the bedroom. A few minutes later, her nephew stopped by to install a new dog door in the side wall of the training arena. He worked quietly, the hum of his drill blending with the steady barking of dogs in their pens. Stephen stepped outside, thanked him for coming, and mentioned that Amy wasn't feeling great. He asked if the boy could take Joe home for a while. He might have to run Amy to urgent care just to be safe. The request didn't seem unusual. Stephen was calm, practical, like always. By 3 in the afternoon, the house was still. The nephew left with Joe, promising to drop him at Amy's parents' later that evening. From the street, nothing looked out of place. A soft plume of smoke rose from the chimney, odd only because the day was so warm. Behind the house in the dog arena, a small class was running agility drills. Students later remembered hearing the faint sound of tires skidding on the pavement. A short screech, then silence. They thought maybe a car had swerved on the highway. No one thought to check. Dusk fell early that day, thick and orange over the quiet subdivision. Around 7:00 p.m., Stephen and Joe stopped at Noodles and Company for dinner. The receipt later showed a chicken Alfredo and a kid's macaroni. Surveillance footage caught them leaving at 7:30, walking side by side through the parking lot. Stephen's phone pinged once on the drive home, registering near their street at 7:53. The house was dark when they pulled into the driveway. Joe unbuckled first, racing ahead to let the dogs out. A few seconds later, his small voice echoed through the hall, sharp and terrified. "Daddy, why is Mommy on the floor?" Stephen ran in after him. Amy lay motionless near the bed, her body half turned toward the door. The room was still, the air thick with something chemical, sweet, heavy, almost metallic. A handgun rested near her left elbow. Stephen called 911. His voice was controlled, almost detached. "My wife's on the floor. She's not breathing." The operator guided him through CPR, but his hands didn't move far from the phone. When paramedics arrived minutes later, the dogs barked wildly at the flashing red lights. They pushed past him into the bedroom, found no pulse, and pronounced her dead. It was 8:02 p.m. Outside, the November air had cooled. Neighbors stepped onto porches drawn by sirens and the sight of emergency vehicles crowding the quiet cul-de-sac. None of them yet knew what the boy had seen inside, or that this night would mark the end of everything they thought they knew about the Allwines of 110th Street. The first patrol unit reached the Allwine home minutes after Stephen's call. Red and blue lights washed over the brick siding. The soft hum of the squad car engine, the only sound in the mild November night. Officers stepped inside, expecting tragedy, but nothing criminal. Another domestic suicide, quiet and contained. The master bedroom door stood open. A single lamp burned low beside the bed, throwing soft amber light across the carpet. Amy lay motionless near the foot of the bed, her arms bent awkwardly, her hair fanned against the rug. A small handgun rested near her left elbow. The weapon was positioned neatly, not dropped. Something felt wrong almost immediately. The blood pattern didn't look right. One officer crouched down, flashlight angled low, and saw that the spray didn't fan outward as suicides usually did. It stretched toward the door, thin trails looping out of the room. There were small, distinct spots leading into the hallway and toward the bathroom. They followed them. Inside the bathroom, the sink glistened. Damp streaks marked the edge of the counter, as if someone had recently wiped it. A hand towel lay balled near the drain, stained faintly pink. On the floor by the tub, another officer noticed a footprint. Bare, small, half-formed in dried blood. It pointed back toward the bedroom. When they switched off the lamp, the pattern deepened. Drops on the tile floor caught the flashlight beam, curved upward along the baseboard. Gravity didn't put them there. They came from something moving through the air. An object. A hand. A weapon. Outside the bathroom, another faint track led farther down the hall to the laundry room. The door was slightly open. Inside sat a pile of clothes, still damp from washing. The washer lid was closed, but condensation fogged its small glass window. Someone had run a load not long ago. The lead officer radioed for the detective unit. "We've got a scene that doesn't look right," he said quietly. When investigators arrived, they began photographing every inch of the hallway, each print, each drop. They collected the towel, the rug, and the gun. On the nightstand beside the bed lay Amy's phone, its screen frozen on a half-typed search. Vertigo, dry mouth, blurred vision. The weapon was a Smith & Wesson shield registered to Stephen. The chamber held a single spent casing, and the muzzle residue showed one close-range discharge. But the angle of the entry wound didn't match where the gun had fallen. If Amy had fired it herself, it would have been impossible for it to land where it did. A forensic tech crouched beside her body, studying her hands under the light. There were no visible gunshot marks, no soot, no residue. Her fingernails were clean. She was right-handed, but the gun had been placed by her left arm. One of the detectives stepped back, taking in the entire scene. The smudged trail, the laundry, the wiped sink. "This isn't suicide," he murmured. "This is cleanup." They called the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the IGI BCA, to take over. By the time their team arrived, the quiet cul-de-sac was crowded with vehicles. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of burning wood from a neighbor's chimney. Inside, the BCA agents began their slow, methodical work. They used luminol, spraying the hall and bathroom in fine mist. When the lights went out, the chemical glow bloomed across the floor in pale blue waves, footprints looping from the bedroom to the laundry and back again. Someone had walked that path after Amy was shot. Someone had cleaned. They took Stephen to the living room for questioning while technicians processed the bedroom. He sat stiff on the couch, answering each question quietly, hands clasped. He said he'd found her like that when he came home. He said she'd been acting dizzy all day. He said he thought she'd taken her own life. In the master bath, another discovery. A faint blood smear on the inside of the doorframe, about waist height. Not from a fall. It looked like something brushed past, hurried. On the kitchen counter near the sink, they found a small roll of paper towels, one sheet half torn, and streaked faintly pink. The house smelled faintly of bleach. By midnight, the body had been removed. The agents walked the perimeter with flashlights, checking the yard and the gravel drive. The chimney smoke still rose steady into the dark sky. It wasn't until they passed the side of the house that one of them noticed the faint trace of soot blowing from the vent. The fireplace had been used that evening, on a warm November night. That seemed strange. When they sifted through the ashes the next morning, they found tiny metal fragments, half-melted plastic, and what looked like charred fabric fasteners. Something had been burned recently, something small enough to fit inside a firebox, but large enough to leave behind residue. The evidence bag labeled fireplace debris was sealed at 8:47 a.m. By the end of that day, the official line had shifted. The scene was no longer logged as a possible suicide. It was now a suspicious death investigation. And as the sun fell behind the cold roofs of Cottage Grove, the name Amy Allwine moved quietly from a domestic file on a clipboard to a murder board inside the BCA's St. Paul field office. The lab reports arrived days later, sealed in a white envelope that bore the state seal and the weight of certainty. It was early morning when the detectives gathered in the small conference room of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Coffee steaming on the table, the November sky outside a sheet of dull grey. The corner summary was brief, but the words inside turned the room cold. Scopolamine. The toxicology screen showed the drug coursing through Amy Allwine's blood, at nearly 40 times the normal therapeutic level, a concentration no doctor would ever prescribe, and no patient could survive. It was a medication typically used in tiny patches for motion sickness or sometimes during surgery to dry secretions. But at that dose, it wasn't medicine. It was poison. They called it devil's breath, a substance known to erase memory, to strip control, to make its victims pliable and confused. In Colombia and parts of Europe, it had been used by criminals to rob or assault, leaving victims awake, but unable to resist. In most cases, those affected couldn't even recall what had happened. Now, it was in a small town woman's body, found dead on her bedroom floor. The medical examiner noted that Amy's pupils were dilated, her mouth and throat severely dry, her blood thickened from dehydration. Her stomach was empty. There were no needle marks. The ingestion had likely been oral, either swallowed in liquid or mixed with food. Investigators turned back to her phone, retrieved from the nightstand beside the bed. The search history told its own story. At 1:48 p.m. that Sunday, Amy had typed vertigo and dry mouth causes. Minutes later, the entries turned into gibberish. Half words, strings of letters that made no sense. It was as if her hands couldn't follow her mind anymore, or her thoughts couldn't stay whole long enough to form sentences. By mid-afternoon, she had stopped typing altogether. The scopolamine explained what the officers at the scene couldn't. Why Amy had seemed so dazed earlier that day. Why she'd told her nephew she was dizzy and laded. Why she'd gone to lie down instead of seeking help. It painted a picture of a woman slipping out of consciousness while her body remained upright. Her thoughts tangled in a fog she couldn't fight. But what it didn't explain was everything else. It didn't explain why a right-handed woman had a gun lying neatly at her left elbow. It didn't explain why there were footprints leading out of the room. Prints that couldn't have been made by someone who never got up again. And it didn't explain why the house smelled faintly of bleach. The medical examiner estimated the drug had been administered within 3 to 6 hours before her death. That meant it was already in her system when she lay down after lunch, long before Stephen said he left the house. Detectives began to cross-reference everything that had happened that day. Receipts, text logs, calls. The last message from Amy's phone was sent shortly before Tukiku's, a brief text to a client confirming a class schedule for the following week. After that, nothing. The scopolamine made one thing clear. Amy hadn't had the strength or clarity to stage anything, much less take her own life. At that concentration, the drug would have left her barely able to stand. Her mind blurred, her coordination gone. The report ended with one quiet line. The level of scopolamine detected is consistent with incapacitation prior to death. Detectives sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent light above them. One of them finally exhaled and said what everyone in the room was already thinking. She didn't do this to herself. From that moment, the tone of the investigation shifted completely. The focus was no longer on how Amy died, but who had helped her die and why. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and slow, covering the parking lot in white. The case that had started with a digital threat on the dark web was now something else entirely. A killing carried out not by an anonymous hitman, but by someone close enough to poison her lunch, watch her stumble, and clean up afterward before calling it a suicide. And for the first time since that night, the detectives knew where to start looking. The search warrant came quietly. No flashing lights, no chaos, just a line of unmarked cars pulling into the driveway on a cold December morning. Stephen Allwine answered the door with the same calm politeness he'd shown since the night of Amy's death. He nodded, stepped aside, and let the investigators in. The house was neat, almost unnaturally so. Every surface gleamed, every cord coiled perfectly, every cabinet labeled. In the basement office where Stephen worked, the air smelled faintly of dust and electronics. 2 monitors glowed with open spreadsheets. A printer hummed softly. On the desk sat 3 external hard drives, a pile of SD cards, and a row of flash drives, each labeled with dates, none with names. Detectives began packing everything: computers, phones, routers, USB sticks, even an old tablet that hadn't been powered on in years. Upstairs, agents moved through the bedroom, collecting the safe, its biometric lock still smudged with fingerprints. Every digital device in the house went into evidence bags, one after another, sealed with white tags bearing Stephen's name. At first glance, there was nothing incriminating, just the traces of a man obsessed with order. But when analysts began digging through his data, the patterns unfolded like threads pulled from a fabric that had been carefully stitched to hide them. On his Samsung Galaxy phone, technicians found 2 apps that didn't belong on an ordinary home screen: Orbot and Orfox. Both were designed to access the Tor network, the encrypted gateway to the dark web. The icons had been hidden inside a utilities folder renamed Tools. In his browsing history, investigators uncovered searches for Tails OS, an operating system built to leave no trace when shut down, the same software used by journalists and hackers alike to mask their online footprints. He'd also searched for convert cash to Bitcoin anonymously, dark web payment escrow, and how to use PGP encryption. The timestamps on those searches told their own story. They were made in March 2016. Days before Dog Day, God had sent money to Bessa Mafia to arrange Amy's death. But the findings didn't stop there. On Stephen's laptop, a hidden folder contained text documents and notes, mundane at first glance. But buried among them was one file that froze the digital forensics team in place. It was a tiny notepad entry, titled Test BT Isutati Gex. Inside was a single string of numbers and letters, 34 characters long, a Bitcoin wallet address. The OI metadata showed it had been created at 11:04 a.m. on March 17, 2016. Exactly 23 seconds later, the same address appeared in the leaked Bassa Mafia communication logs under the user DogDayGod. The match was perfect. The odds of coincidence astronomical. Bitcoin addresses are unique, impossible to duplicate by accident. The same wallet that DogDayGod had used to pay for a hit on Amy Allwine now sat inside a text file created on her husband's computer. Investigators stared at the screen, the weight of realization settling in. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some faceless criminal from overseas. The man who'd hired a hitman to kill Amy had been living in her house, eating at her table and tucking their child into bed each night. When they dug deeper into the encrypted archives, the connections multiplied. Stephen's search history showed repeated visits to dog training forums and travel sites for Moline, Illinois, the same city where the supposed hit was first planned to happen. He'd looked up Linter in Moline routes from Cottage Grove to Quad Cities and dog trial dates April 2016. All details that the Bassa Mafia user had shared with the supposed killers. The coincidences had become evidence. In the cloud backup recovered from Stephen's account, analysts found another small text file. This one listed several usernames and passwords. Some belonged to business accounts and church login-ins, but one stood out. DogDayGod Mail. It wasn't an active address anymore. It had been deleted months earlier, but its ghost remained. A trace of the account used to reach out to hitmen for hire. The digital evidence was now indisputable. The same device, the same wallet, the same timing. Every digital fingerprint led back to Stephen. When detectives confronted him with the findings, he sat still for a long time. The room was quiet, except for the buzz of the overhead light. Then, with that same calm that had never cracked since Amy's death, he said, "I don't know how that got there." But the agents didn't believe him. By the time they left the house, the boxes of electronics filled an entire SUV. The evidence tags glinted under the streetlights as they loaded the last of it into the trunk. Behind them, the house on 110th Street looked ordinary again. Lights off, curtains drawn. Inside, the machines that had once hidden a digital murder for hire were gone, and the secret Stephen had kept for months was finally exposed. The name DogDayGod wasn't a stranger's alias. It was his own. By the time detectives pieced together Stephen's digital trail, his story was already beginning to unravel. What had started as a confident account, structured, rehearsed and steady, now sounded less like truth and more like memory rehearsed too often. He told them he'd been working that Sunday, that he'd spent most of the day downstairs in his office, logging into servers for his IT clients, troubleshooting network issues, sending invoices. He'd said he'd stopped briefly to check on Amy when she mentioned feeling dizzy, then gone back to work. Later, he claimed he left to pick up dinner with their son. It sounded logical, measured. But when investigators requested the company's network logs, the record told a quieter, harder truth. Stephen's last login was at 12:03 p.m. After that, nothing. No remote connections, no pings from his computer, no activity from his credentials. The digital silence stretched through the entire afternoon, precisely the hours Amy was dying upstairs. When they showed him the report, Stephen frowned, leaned forward, and said maybe the server had logged him out automatically. He said he'd been doing offline tasks. He said anything that would fit, but every new explanation tangled tighter around the same question. If he wasn't working, what was he doing? Detectives then turned to the house cameras, devices Stephen himself had installed only months earlier. They reviewed every feed from that day, combing through hours of footage. The driveway camera showed him leaving the house at 6:47 p.m. with his son. No one else entered before that, and no movement appeared on any exterior camera until the pair returned at 7:53. Amy had died sometime between those times, or possibly before he ever left. The agents replayed the 911 call again, this time listening not for panic, but for tone. His voice never cracked. His words came clipped, factual, but it was something in the background that caught their attention. The faint voice of a child. Joe's small voice drifted through the recording, trembling but clear. "Daddy, are you going to remarry?" The room fell silent as the playback ended. It wasn't the kind of question a child invents in terror. It was a thought repeated, something heard before, something rehearsed. The transcript was added to evidence. At the lab, the forensics team analyzed Stephen's clothing collected that night. His jeans, his shirt, his socks, all bagged and sealed. Under the microscope, technicians found gunshot residue, tiny metallic particles fused from lead, beryllium, and antimony, clinging to the webbing of his right hand and wrist. He said he'd touched the gun after finding Amy, that the residue must have come from there. But the pattern was too heavy, too even. It looked like discharge, not contamination. Then came the footprints, the luminol test from the hallway. Those glowing blue imprints that trailed from the bedroom to the laundry had been compared against every shoe and foot in the house. Amy's feet were too small, the child's too short, but Stephen's matched perfectly down to the arch and the length of each toe. He insisted he'd walked through the blood trying to check on her, but the sequence of prints told a different story. They started near the bed, moved outward, then doubled back, pausing at the bathroom, the laundry, the washer controls. They weren't the steps of a man rushing to help. They were the steps of someone cleaning. In one of the clearer prints, a small weave pattern appeared at the heel, the faint outline of a cotton sock. The lab confirmed it. No tread, no shoe sole, just fabric. That discovery created an impossible contradiction. On the night of Amy's death, Stephen was wearing shoes when paramedics arrived, but the blood pattern showed bare socks. Somewhere in the hours before that 911 call, the shoes had been changed, the socks swapped, and the originals never found. When questioned again, Stephen's answers grew thinner. His confidence faltered for the first time. The pauses between his sentence stretched longer. The tidy edges of his story started to fray. Detectives watched him carefully. The man who once seemed so composed now looked tired, cornered, calculating his next word. The simple picture he'd drawn, a husband returning home to tragedy, was collapsing under its own weight. And beneath the polite tone, the fixed posture, and the memorized answers, investigators could feel what he was trying to hide. Something cold, rehearsed, and years in the making. The alibi that once protected Stephen Allwine had begun to dissolve, and with it, the illusion of innocence that had covered his home. The interview stretched late into winter. Each session peeled away another layer of the man who'd built his life around sermons and respectability. By now, the detectives knew that every answer Stephen gave had to be tested against the record. His words polished like glass, his voice calm, but empty of warmth. They had one more question waiting, one that touched the nerve of the whole case. The anonymous dark web buyer, who called himself Dog Day God, had written obsessively about infidelity, about a woman who had slept with her husband, about betrayal, revenge, and humiliation. It wasn't random language. It was the language of someone jealous. When they asked Stephen about it, the silence hung long enough to make the room feel airless. He looked down at his hands, then admitted it softly, almost like confession. He'd been unfaithful. The story came out in fragments. It started, he said, when he'd heard about a website called Ashley Madison, a service for married people looking for something discreet. He'd gone there out of curiosity, or so he claimed. But soon curiosity turned into messages, then meetings. He spoke of one woman in particular, Michelle, petite, blonde, in her 40s, married, but in an open relationship. Their first encounter had been nothing illicit, he said, just coffee after a doctor's appointment. But soon, there were lunches, hotel rooms, and quiet weekend trips when Amy was away judging dog trials. Once he even took Michelle on a work trip, checking them both into a hotel under separate names. It hadn't been his first betrayal. Before Michelle, he'd met another woman from the same site. Before that, he'd driven to Iowa twice to spend the night with an escort. The payments were recorded in his travel expenses as overnight consulting. For a man ordained in his church, whose title was elder and whose sermons had warned against eyes full of adultery, the contradictions were staggering. To his congregation, he'd been a model of moral steadiness. To the detectives across the table, he now looked like a man living behind 100 small lies. He said the affair with Michelle ended months before Amy's death, that they'd only met for lunch once afterward just to tie up loose ends. But then he added one more detail, something he hadn't meant to. During that September lunch, he'd told her everything about the supposed dark web threat against his wife, about the FBI visit, the anonymous hitman, and how someone wanted Amy dead because of a business rivalry. Michelle told investigators later that she'd been stunned by his composure. The way he said it sounded rehearsed, like a man testing a story. It was around that time detectives discovered that Stephen had filed a strange police report of his own. In March 2016, weeks after Dog Day God sent Bitcoin to Bassa Mafia, he'd walked into the Cottage Grove station claiming he'd been defrauded in an online trade. He said he'd tried to buy educational materials from a man named Mark, paid him in Bitcoin, and never received the goods. He'd even handed over a single email from the supposed scammer to prove it. But when investigators dug through his computers, They couldn't find any prior messages with Mark. Only that one, sent from a disposable address that forensic analysts traced back to Stephen himself. The timing was no coincidence. The fraud report was dated just days after the Bassa Mafia transaction that paid for Amy's murder. To detectives, it looked like a man writing his own alibi, building a reason for why his name might someday appear next to Bitcoin. When confronted, Stephen didn't flinch. He said the report was genuine, that he'd truly been scammed. He said he didn't know how his email could have come from the same address as the buyer on the dark web. But the quiet certainty he'd once worn, like armor, was gone. His words were careful now. Too careful. And his eyes flicked often toward the door, as though the walls around him were beginning to close. For months he'd hidden two lives under one roof, the preacher and the deceiver, the husband and the man who tried to erase his wife. And now every piece of that hidden life, the affairs, the lies, the counterfeit report, was stacked neatly into evidence boxes, waiting for the day he'd have to answer for all of it in court. It was a brittle January afternoon, the kind when the cold settles into the metal of car doors and stays there. Snow rimmed the sidewalks in Cottage Grove, soft grey exhaust rising from tailpipes. Stephen Alwine was driving home from what he said was a client visit, his car heater humming, his jaw tight against the silence that had become his only company. Then the flashing lights appeared behind him. He slowed, checked his mirror, signaled to pull over on a quiet stretch of the county road. Two squad cars rolled in, close behind. The officers didn't approach immediately. One of them spoke into his shoulder mic. The other stayed by the driver's side, hand on his belt. When they finally stepped forward, Stephen rolled down the window. "Mr. Alwine?" He nodded, his voice faint. "Yes, step out of the vehicle." He hesitated for half a second, the kind of pause that reads as calculation more than confusion. Then he opened the door. The wind hit him first, sharp, dry, cutting through the thin wool of his coat. He stood still as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. The metal was cold against his skin. The words came flat, procedural. "You're under arrest for the murder of Amy Alwine." There was no spectacle, no shouting, just the slow rhythm of protocol. The Miranda warning echoing in the crisp air. The shuffle of boots on packed snow. The slam of the cruiser door. The same community that once sought his counsel now watched his name crawl across news alerts like a confession in print. Inside the sheriff's office, the tone shifted from suspicion to certainty. The prosecutor's files had swollen into volumes. Printouts, maps, transaction records, photographs, every line connecting him to a plan that read like a blueprint for murder. The charge was upgraded that same day from secondary to first-degree premeditated murder. The language of the indictment was clinical, but its meaning was brutal. This was not impulse. It was orchestration. They believed he'd poisoned Amy's lunch that Sunday using the same scopolamine, later found in her blood. When the drug dulled her coordination and speech, he sent their son with a relative under the pretense of running to urgent care. The moment the boy was gone, the sequence began. Investigators reconstructed it, minute by minute. Amy would have been confused, trying to stand, maybe calling his name. The toxin made her dizzy, her limbs heavy. Near the hallway, the muzzle flash left microscopic residue on the doorway trim, proof she was shot standing, not lying down. Afterward, he moved her body to the bedroom, arranging it near the nightstand where the gun was found. Then came the cleanup. Blood diluted by cleaner in the bathroom sink. A roll of paper towels half burned in the fireplace, alongside charred fabric fibers that matched a missing pair of jeans. Investigators found the burn residue days later, sifted from the ashes. Seats traced his path after that. Gasoline, a restaurant meal, the timed appearance of normal life. His card activity painted the image he wanted police to see. A father taking his child to dinner, unaware of the nightmare waiting at home. But when the timeline aligned, it read like choreography. Poison, isolation, execution, cleansing, errands, discovery. Every step accounted for. Every minute shaped to leave the impression of coincidence. In the county jail that night, Stephen asked for a Bible. He read quietly in his cell. A preacher now stripped of his pulpit. A husband stripped of his story. Down the hall, the evidence sat in sealed boxes. His laptop, his phone, a single slip of paper with a 34-character Bitcoin string that had unraveled everything. The town of Cottage Grove slept under thin snow. Lights flickering in kitchen windows. Families closing doors against the cold. But in one home on 110th Street, the air no longer belonged to the living. The slow cooker was gone. The curtains drawn. And behind the frost-touched glass, the house stood still, like a monument to what deception can destroy. By morning, the news had broken across Minnesota. Church leader charged in wife's murder, and beneath it, the image that had haunted everyone since that first knock at noon. Amy's warm smile beside the man who'd sworn to protect her. The courthouse in Hastings was old brick and limestone, its halls echoing with the low murmur of reporters, attorneys, and family members who had waited more than a year for this moment. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, turning the sidewalks slick, the gutters whispering with runoff. Inside, under the vaulted ceiling of the Dakota County courtroom, State of Minnesota versus Stephen Allwine began. For 8 days, the air barely shifted. The jurors sat in silence as the prosecution laid its map across the room. Digital breadcrumbs, photographs, charts, the story of a marriage hollowed out from within. The state opened not with the dark web, but with Amy, her work, her family, the ordinariness of the life she built. Then came the fracture. The Bitcoin transactions, the Tor browser, the email accounts with names like Dog Day God and Jane. Each witness added a thread. A forensic analyst from the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension described the pattern of sock prints on the hallway floor, identical in size and pressure to Stephen's own feet. A toxicologist explained the scopolamine levels found in Amy's body, 40 times higher than anything remotely therapeutic. The digital forensics expert pulled up screenshots from his laptop, searches for dark web hitman site, scopolamine dosage, how to make murder look like suicide. Then came the physical trail, the matching Bitcoin wallet, the Tor gateway apps, Orbot and Orfox, the fake police report meant to explain away the cryptocurrency long before the crime. Piece by piece, the life he tried to stage as faithful husband and grieving widower hour was reduced to metadata, receipts, and fingerprints. The defense worked quietly, measuredly, trying to slow the momentum. They suggested a hacker. They hinted the files were planted. They pointed out there were no eyewitnesses, no direct footage of the act itself. But every time they spoke, another digital timestamp answered them. The jurors watched the body camera footage of the house, the false calm of the living room, the spotless kitchen, the half-burned towels in the fireplace. They listened to the 911 recording, the tremor in Stephen's voice, the child's question, small, uncomprehending, unforgettable. When the state rested, the courtroom fell into that strange stillness that follows revelation. The defense called no witnesses. Stephen didn't take the stand. He sat at the table in a grey suit, his hands folded, his wedding band gone. Deliberation began just before noon on the 8th day. 6 hours later, the bailiff opened the door and said softly, "They have a verdict." The jurors filed back into their seats, faces drawn, expressions unreadable. The clerk read it out, voice steady, but quiet enough that people leaned forward to catch every word. Guilty. First, a premeditated murder. Amy's family held one another, eyes closed. The reporter scribbled without speaking. Stephen blinked once, twice, then lowered his head. He didn't look at anyone. Not the judge, not the jurors, not the mother of the woman he'd killed. When the sentence came, it was final, and without appeal to mercy. Life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. As the deputies led him away, the sound of chains brushing against the tile was the only noise in the room. Outside, the sky had turned the pale color of ice. A few remaining church members stood on the courthouse steps, holding photographs of Amy, their breath rising in the cold. For them, justice wasn't victory. It was silence. And in that silence, the story of Amy Allwine ended where it had begun. In a quiet Minnesota town, where a faithful woman once believed her home was safe, and where truth, buried under years of deception, finally surfaced, clear, undeniable, and cold as the winter air. Stephen Allwine spends his life behind the walls of Stillwater Prison, a man who once preached about purity, now living with the silence of his own deception. His name faded from sermons and screens, but Amy's never did. Her kindness, her faith, her quiet steadiness outlived the cruelty that tried to erase her. The house on 110th Street was sold long ago, but neighbors say that for years after the porch light would flicker some nights, a small, almost invisible sign of remembrance. Amy's parents are raising her son, teaching him about the mother who loved him, not the crime that took her away. The FBI later confirmed that Bassa Mafia, the dark web marketplace that promised murder for money, was nothing more than a scam site run by a handful of faceless fraudsters. Yet for Amy, the threat was no illusion. A fake hitman didn't kill her. A husband did. Her story has since become part of FBI and cybercrime training, a lesson about how easily ordinary life can be invaded by the internet's darkest corners, and how technology, when joined with human deceit, can become a weapon. And as her community rebuilt itself, something deeper settled into the silence she left behind. The realization that even in homes built on faith, darkness can live quietly behind closed doors. Amy's story teaches us more than a crime. It exposes a truth about human nature and modern life. Deception doesn't begin online. It begins in the heart. The web may hide evil, but it's human hands that guide it. Trust is fragile. Even the people who appear most righteous can wear two faces. One for the world, one for themselves. Technology doesn't create monsters. It reveals them. Behind every anonymous screen name, there's a person making a choice, and silence can be fatal. If something feels wrong, speak, share, question, because secrets grow strongest in quiet rooms. Do you think Stephen's crime was born out of hypocrisy or pure calculation? Could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had looked closer? And what does this case say about the way we trust in faith, in marriage, and in technology? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice might help someone see the warning signs before it's too late. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep uncovering the stories that deserve to be remembered and the lessons we can't afford to forget.